on Vine Street, 58 Vine, I think that's the number. You went upstairs, a creaky bunch of stairs, and there were a couple of rooms there that they used for the cheder. And in the cheder they had very unprofessional teachers. And the remarkable thing is that kids came out of there that could daven. You would pay, I think, 50 cents a week to have your child go there. And if you couldn't afford it, they still let the kids in. But they had a stick, make sure that you sat still, and it was hard to keep the kids sitting.
Cheder, where I went to, there was a Mr. Loomer who used to be a teacher, and he was on Cathcart Street, I think. And there was physical punishment, of course, if you didn't toe the mark or so. The same thing, I went to a cheder on Napier Street with my brothers, and the idea there was discipline. So I managed to pick up my Hebrew, I think, in that respect, in between a few little hard knocks. But other than that, as I say, I was there with the other kids, and got well.
I had a Rabbi Katz, I think his name was. He lived on Catherine Street or something down there. It used to cost me $2, well, my father used to cost $2 a week to teach me.
For the bar mitzvah?
Yeah, and anyway, I always had a vest, like my father used to make me my clothes, pants, vest, and a jacket. So I stuck the $2 in the vest pocket, and I'd get to the, soon after it's over, I'd try looking for the $2. I can't find the $2, so I begged. Did I get it from my old man? At that time, $2 was a lot of money. You know, I'm talking about 32, 33. Anyway, I grew up and I learned.
I went to a shul. I did this on my own. I was coming home from school one day, and I went to Hess Street School. I don't know if you ever heard about Hess Street School. That's where most of us went. And I saw this Mr. Brick, and he was with the Hashemer Hatzer. And I didn't know what that was, but he was teaching you to read and write Yiddish. It was not Hebrew. And you know, it was the most wonderful thing I ever did, because I learned how to speak and to read Yiddish. And I wrote to my 2 cousins in Russia until the war, and they wrote to us at that time and told us not to try and find them.
But Talmud Torah was a Hebrew school. Sophie Croach was one of my teachers, and Joshua Katz was another teacher. And I went to Hebrew school until I was bar mitzvahed. I was bar mitzvahed at the old Beth Jacob Synagogue up on Hunter Street many years ago.
Mr. Katz was the teacher, Joshua Katz, who lived in Cathcart Street. Miss Croach was also a teacher. I mean, these were fixtures that were there. You'd think that they would live forever. You had Altschuler, who was the Yiddish teacher. So those teachers, the kids took advantage of all the teachers. Mr. Katz was a very soft-spoken, sweet man. And my brother especially had trouble there at Talmud Torah. And one of the teachers was chasing him, so he was on the 2nd floor. He opened the window and jumped out, which was par for the course for him. One teacher, I will not name who, I went to Talmud Torah when I was 5 years old. And my cousin, who lives in Hamilton, was in the same class, although he was older than I. Not considered, but a few years older than I. And he either looked funny at the teacher or what, but the teacher picked him up by the scuff of the neck and threw him down. And the desks went flying. And I was absolutely traumatized. I picked myself up and ran all the way home and told my mother, I'm never going to Talmud Torah again.
In this community, there was a temple Sunday school, there was the community Talmud Torah, and that's the way things were done. And it was done from time immemorial. And that's where you got your Jewish education. Did you get a good Jewish education? For then, yes. But was the Jewish education that you got comparable to either to the day school? Absolutely not. I mean, it was much more intensified in that atmosphere. Rabbi Green established the day school, which I think started the whole thing. But you know what? You still could have had the community Talmud Torah, because the day school was a day school, you know, a full service program with the exception of some type of physical education. But the straw that broke the camel's back was Rabbi Wiener. And if you think that the Hamel Hebrew Academy got instant acceptance, they didn't. It was a tough battle. And were it not for the perseverance of Rabbi Morton Green, it would never have survived.
Our concerns at that time as Jews was not to rock the boat. Don't say things controversial, keep low key, keep passive, accepting. We were too small a group to do things, and there were too many of them and not enough of us. And we just knew that we had to keep our place. And as long as you did that, there was no problem getting along. If you tried to do too much to try to push yourself as Jews, you were going to be in trouble.
We used to go to Bronte Beach. We went there one day. There's a sign out, no Jews or dogs allowed. So we came back to Hamilton. We got a friend with a truck. And we went around Cannon Street, York Street. Hop on. We got a good gang together with bats. And we went out there, but we didn't take the bats off the truck. We left them there. And we went into where they were swimming. And nobody said a word to us or told us to leave. They saw what was going to go on. It was going to be like Christie Pitts in Toronto, but it didn't happen.
I used to go to my teacher to learn for B'mafter for my bar mitzvah after school to his house. He lived on Wellington Street, and I would walk from Caroline and Harriet over, which was quite a walk. Coming home one night, going down Mulberry Street, or Bay Street, there's a shower of stones coming at me. And I got hit in the knee with one of them. So I crawled over to a fence to get away from the stones. But I saw who did it. The next night, I went for my lesson. I came back the same way. And there were only two of them standing there then. So I grabbed them by the back of the neck, both of them, banged their heads together, and told them if they ever threw another stone at me, they'd lose their arms. That was the end of that problem.
Speaking of Jewish or non-Jews, there was an undercurrent of anti-Semitism that sometimes flared up. And I think most of us had our schoolyard fights. And, you know, they say you've got to be taught, and I think that's really true, because most of the kids who we associated with, or who insulted us in one way or another, or called us names, of course they had never really associated with Jews other than us, and they were told by their parents, you know, this was a time when religion, especially the Christian religion, was, I mean, there was no question about you were either a Christian or you were, the rest could be put into a very small pocket. There were no, I don't think there were any Muslims around at that time, and Jews formed a small proportion. So we had our problems and our fights.
It was when we were kids, and it didn't bother me because afterwards I realized that what happened was based on ignorance, and I had a neighbor kid, 6 years old, talked to me on the street one day. He says, "I don't like you because Jews killed Jesus." Well, I was in big trouble because I went home to ask my mother who Jesus was. You know, at 6 years old, I didn't have a clue. And it never come up in school yet. And my mother gave me some story, and I don't even remember what it was. But what it showed me is how ignorant people are, that the kid heard this at home. He wasn't smart enough to figure this out by himself. And I laughed at the stupidity of the whole thing.
It wasn't until I got into high school and I thought I was very friendly with the Catholic girl in high school. And we were walking along the street someday. I didn't look very Jewish to begin with. I was always blonde, and I really did not have Semitic features, and I didn't look at, and Sachs is not really a very Jewish name, and we didn't go into things like that. And I remember she made some horrible slur about the Jews, and I thought she was my friend. And to this day, it sort of cuts me to the quick.
Most of my associates were usually Jewish kids. We never really felt it, with the exception of the odd time, they used to go like this to us. You know what that means, don't you?
No.
Jews killed Christ. You never knew that?
I've never seen it.
Well, now you have. Look at what you've learned. Or they used to call us Sheeny. But in those days, we never thought too much about it because we never really got intimate with them. I do remember, of course, at the time when they had the big, during the war, before the war, when they used to have gang fights in Toronto, when they used to turn around and the Jewish boys got together with the clubs and with the Italians, and they used to have a lot of problems in Toronto. We never had anything like that in Hamilton.
When I went to public school, that there was a family that lived on Caroline Street, and there were, I think, 4 children in the family, and they would call me, as I was walking to school, derogatory names, and the one lad was really quite abusive, and I would come home crying some days.
Now, I'll tell you another incident that happened in the 50s with me. I became a golfer. Not a good golfer, but I go on the golf course. And somebody from Burlington Golf and Country Club invited me there, and we had a round of golf. This gent got a letter advising him not to invite me or any other Jew to the Burlington.
There were a number of service clubs, the Rotary, Lions, Kiwanis, they were all restricted. Charlie Levinson was the first person that was admitted to Rotary, and that was probably not until the late 40s, and he was the one Jewish exception. He was involved in many things. He was on the board of St. Joseph's Hospital, on the board of McMaster University, and he was also a member of the Hamilton Club. The Hamilton Club was also restricted. It was a men's club, I don't know, it's still there maybe, on the corner of Main and James. It was a dinner club, and it was on the east corner of Main and James. But it was, like everything else, restricted.
When I applied for a junior internship at St. Mike's Hospital in Toronto, and I didn't get in, and several of my classmates got in, and actually I had I knew that I should have got in, you know, somewhat modest, but I was on graduate honors, and I was in the Honor Society, and had a lot of things that really should be going for you. And but it was interesting. So I went try to go down and see the sister at St. Mike's and have a talk with the in charge. I was rather upset about it, and I went down there myself, and she wouldn't see me, and but it was interesting when I came back. Some of my other classmates none of them accepted down there.
People believed the propaganda that was existing about Jewish people couldn't get into it. It was like university. It was hard for Jewish people to get into a straight university course years ago, because obviously there are prejudices. They're there.
There were 2 private schools in Hamilton, Hillfield, which up until the 50s didn't have any Jewish students. Strathallan, as I can recall, Leo Barnett's daughters were admitted to Strathallan, and that was in the late 40s.
When I bought this house, going back 40 years ago, Joe Sweet, he was a judge. He wouldn't let me buy the house because in the papers around the city hall, no Jews allowed.
Right.
I wanted to buy land at Mayfair Crescent, and they wouldn't allow any Jews to buy land there.
Really?
And we did not.
We tried to buy a home, and my father had arranged it, and the house was $5,500, which at that time bought a nice single home, single standing home. We eventually bought a home at 119 Melrose, and that we paid $5,500 for, so that gives you an idea of what that kind of money bought in those days. And he arranged the deal and everything. The next day, he went back to close the deal, to sign the papers, and he took Bill Schreiber as the lawyer. And when my father went with Bill Schreiber, he put one and one together and realized, hey, this fellow's Jewish. I can't sell a house to him. My neighbors will be very up in arms. And so he said, oh, no, it wasn't $5,500. You made a mistake. It was $15,500. Well, of course, in those days, for $15,500, you could have bought a castle. So that it was just a convenient way of saying no Jews allowed.
There was a great guy here in Hamilton by the name of Wilf Carter. He owned Carter's, he owned new automobile places, and I knew him very, very well. And we were talking one day, and he told me the story about this woman who knocked on his door. His butler was busy doing something else. He went to open the front door. He was a very wealthy man, lived in a huge house in Burlington. And I was there at that house. And he said this woman had a petition. And what was the petition about? She wanted him to sign it so a Jewish couple couldn't buy a house on that block. His answer was, I haven't met these people yet. They may be very nice, but I know you're not, so please leave.
I can remember going with my mother when I was about 5 or 6 years old. That'd be in the middle 30s. And we went to Community Beach to rent a cottage. We generally had a cottage in Hamilton Beach, where quite a lot of the other Jewish families had cottages in the summertime. Keeping in mind there was no air conditioning in those days, and it got pretty hot in the city. So the beach with water on both sides was a little cooler. And we went through the house, and the cottage rather, and when we came out, as we were just walking out, the woman said, by the way, what religion are you? And we walked out, and I said to my mother, that's a nice place. Are we going to be coming here? My mother said, no, we're not coming there. I said, why not? And she said, well, didn't you hear what the woman asked? I said, but you didn't answer her. She said, I didn't have to answer her. I knew what she meant.
Later on, there was problems, like people looking for work. And if you were Jewish, you couldn't hide. There was a quiet anti-Semitism. My brother was a graduate at MIT, who came back to Canada, who was an engineering officer in the Air Force, and he worked actually with the guy who developed the jet engine in England. Irwin worked with him on the first jet engines in Manchester. During the war, even though he was in the Air Force, he was seconded out. When he came back to Canada, he couldn't get a job as an engineer.
Once you put your name down, if they ask you for your religion, that was it. I can't think of anybody that really worked for a non-Jewish firm And we're talking a lot of people. There just nobody ever got a job. When the war came along, then things started changing.
So Hamilton wasn't just a dead city or anything like that. We were a very viable city. Really, we were.
There was Granick, Argyle, Shure, and Halpern. There were 4 Schachtim. Halpern or Shure, I don't know which one, I think it was Halpern, was a moil as well. But mostly they brought in the moil from Toronto.
Now we also had we had 3 Schachtim in Hamilton at that time. One was Mr. Granick, the other was Mr. Orgel, and there was Mr. Loomer later. But Loomer, yeah. Now, Mr. Like Granick, he had the slaughter place. He didn't slaughter big animals, just chickens, geese, ducks, but he did not do anything like a cow or anything. They went to someplace else.
If my mother had a couple of chickens, I would help her take the chickens to the shochet, and I would watch when he would hold the chicken or a duck, depending what it was you were doing, and he would examine it to see that it was ritually pure for health, that it was not damaged, and he'd pluck a few feathers from the neck and bend the head back a bit to stretch the neck, and he had a straight bladed knife with no nicks, couldn't have any blemishes on it, and he would cut the throat of the bird, and there were funnel-shaped gadgets in the slaughterhouse, and the bird was tucked in there to bleed for a few minutes, and the women that brought it in, they could pluck the chicken themselves, or they could give a dime to some of the non-Jewish women that needed to earn a living, and if you could afford it, or you had more than one chicken, you'd pay these ladies to pluck the chicken.
Boleslavsky's was the deli. There was,
Where was it? Just
on York Street. York Street. Farther up was the Zuckers, had a delicatessen, and then Bill Cohn took that one over. And in between was Mrs. Platt, had a delicatessen. And her son was a tavel, she said, which means a little devil.
There were several delicatessens. Boleslavsky's, of course, being the most popular. And there was Bill Cohn and Al Sachs who had a delicatessen. Mrs. Platt had a delicatessen. Mrs. Zucker had a delicatessen. Mrs. Lax had a delicatessen. And that's what drew the people to York Street, with these delicatessens. And of course the fruit dealers, it was Wright Fruit Company, Sam Netkin and Cy Friedman, Sam Krieger. There were many, many fruit dealers and peddlers, of course, all came to York Street, of all the surrounding area. And we had a conglomerate of everything there. And it was just a wonderful time. And however, we weren't what I would say prosperous, but we were happy, very happy.
For a nickel, you could buy a loaf of bread, you could buy a dozen eggs for a dime, you could buy a pound of butter for 12 cents. 5 pounds of sugar was about a quarter.
A nickel or a dime was a lot, because a loaf of bread was a dime. Sliced bread was 11 cents. So guess what? We bought the whole loaf.
Used, anything used on York Street. That's where they started. On Saturday night, they'd sit out on the street, and you'd walk by Motzei Shabbos. Everybody was on the street, all the boys and girls, our age group, kids. And the Rosenbergs had a grocery store. The Yaffes had a grocery store. Then, yes, and the Scots, a delicatessen, was on York and Caroline.
The parents met primarily at Rosenberg's grocery store, which was on York Street, I think one door away from the corner of Caroline. That was really part of the center of Jewish Hamilton because they were strictly kosher.
The store was closed about 11:30, 12. You never said when. It was as long as there was a live customer, you were there to take them in. But we had the delicatessen, so my mother would make up the parcels to be delivered for Sunday.
We enjoyed ourselves very much growing up in that milieu. It was very, very nice, and although none of us were what you would call wealthy, we had a wealth of family and people who would come to enjoy our conversations and so on.
We did what kids did all over. We had no money. We had a wonderful time. When my father was alive, Friday night, my mother would make Shabbos. And in those days, of course, you had to have the Shabbos guy come in and turn your light on and everything. She would make, and we would set the table. We never knew for how many people, because my father would go to shul, and whoever didn't have where to go, he would bring home. So he'd either bring home 2 people, he could bring home as many as 6 people.
We lived at 257 York, and the Blooms were across the street. They were sort of a men's haberdashery. And next to them was the Lee's family, and he too had a men's haberdashery. And there was Joe and Ida Foreman, who had a little restaurant, and Louis Goldberg and Dorothy, who had a grocery store. And on the left of us were the Yanivers, and many Jews going all the way down to King and James, down to York and James.
And you had Bolslawski's Delicatessen, which was a place where everyone went. And we went there right through the 60s when I was a young lawyer, because that's where everyone met. Vic Kops was there every day. We were all getting a cholesterol fix. We didn't have a clue what the hell we were doing to our bodies, but that's the way it was. There was York Delicatessen. On the other side of the street was Al Sachs and Bill Cohen. There was Platt's Delicatessen, which was on the other side of the street, and that then was taken over by someone else. Murray Parts was at the corner. Across the street next to Bolslawski's was Gordon Zwicker, who had his auto parts store, and Sam Katz and family had their place on the other corner. The fourth corner was made up of the Fisher Hotel.
Next to Quitco's was Joe Levy, the tailor, and he did cleaning and pressing and alterations. And I delivered, on Saturday I would deliver cleaning to people that couldn't come in for, so I had the cleaning over my back and I'm riding the bike with one hand. Then there was a bakery, and of course at Pesach we would be, the kids would be pressing their nose against the window looking at all these marguerites and all these fancy baked goods at Pesach time. Then there was Vern Webster had a tie shop. Steve Stoyanovich was the artistic embroidery, and the people from Aberdeen Avenue would bring their fine linens down to them to be embroidered. And they also carried fine linens in stock if people wanted to buy linen. Then on the corner was the Denbury family, and I think that was the last of the businesses on the street then.
Most people think of the Jewish community in Hamilton as being in the York, Cannon, James Street North area, which it was, but there was also a very large Jewish community outside of that area. We had people on Kenilworth Avenue, we had people on Ottawa, Grosvenor, and from Gage right through to St. Clair, Proctor, a lot of people. and as well as on Aberdeen, the Aberdeen area, and in Westdale, and in the 30s and 40s. And there was a very big Jewish community. I imagine probably at least half or more of the Jewish community were in those areas.
I was about 12, and I started staying in the store at 7 because I was 7 years old, but I used to give change, and I used to give them all pennies because I couldn't count so much. But it was very hard there. We used to have a corned beef sandwich was a nickel. A hot dog was a nickel. And, you know, it was a very difficult time. And this one lady came in, a Jewish lady, and she had about 6 children. And she said to me in Yiddish, "Vart cent wurscht." So I would slice up first to her. So I'd give her this, and then she said to me, "Das Christlein." And that is, we used to have to slice our own bread for the sandwiches, so we had a hand slicer. And so the first 2 slices were always too small, so I gave her the Christlein. And she says, "And a bissel of mustard?" So I said to my mother, "She's not going to pay for it anyway. She's going to put down the books, and we're already losing money on her." And my mother said to me, "Are you hungry? Are you ever hungry? Then think about her with those 6 children." I never ever forgot that. But that was typical of what it was like in those days. Nobody had anything.
We actually loved Hamilton. Growing up the way we did in Hamilton, it was a great place to live. And you know, and a lot of us had stayed here.
It was a time when we knew we were Jewish. Being Jewish was what we were. It wasn't something of choice. We had to be Jewish, we had to be together, and we did. And those years I think back on, I think how fortunate we were to live in Hamilton at that time.
In the 30s and 40s, most of the retail, most of the Jews were in stores or they were peddlers. Very, very few worked for somebody else other than in the automotive business, the auto parts business, and the scrap business. The predominant families were the Goldblatts, and then there was the Levys, and then there was the Hotzes and Pekins, and in the automotive it was the Katz family, Murray Auto Parts, Gordon's Auto Parts, Atlas Auto Parts, which was Sid Cudlett's, my buddy, Phil Rosenshine with Midtown Auto, and they all did very, very nicely. But very, very few people, very, very few Jews were able to get jobs in those days.
In the scrap business, Frank Levy's father, Uncle Dave Levy, the Waxmans, the Pekins, and a few other old-timers. I just forget their names now.
Well, there's
there are
the
quite a
Rochwork,
few.
right?
Rochworks?
Morris Lax?
Morris Lax. Well, he came later.
Yeah.
Yeah, Morris Lax came later. They used to start off with a horse and buggy. I mean, that was no jokes. They used to rock around and cry out, "Rags, bones, and bottles." Behind that office that you see there, there's a stable. They used to keep the horses there. I mean, not many, 2 or 3 horses.
The peddlers with their horse and wagon, they just lined up on the street to sell their wares to Saul Hoffman. They got money for it. They made a living on it. Where they got it, They'd go all over, any place to get it.
My late father, Nathan Sauter, who came from Poland, wound up in New York, wound up coming to Canada when, during World War I, they were short of tailors. My father and a bunch of single guys in New York who had come to New York, became tailors, were asked to come to work in a local factory called Sanford's in Hamilton. They liked it and they decided to stay. My father was not meant to be a tailor. He was an outdoors type of guy, and he became a junk peddler and a fruit peddler, and eventually became a what you would call a teamster. He had horses, and he would hire himself out to various construction jobs to haul dirt or whatever. During the winter time, construction sort of went flat, so he hired himself out as a driver and delivery of coal, and eventually started selling coal to his Jewish friends and started a coal business.
There were, and I actually sat down with a couple of friends and we started to think about the number of women's wear stores that were on King Street, and came up with the number 18. So King Street East was a real center for fashion. I mean, these involved everything from sportswear to coats, suits, and dresses, and just about everything that a woman shopper would want in the way of clothes. So it was a real marketplace and a very successful place for the merchants. And by the way, these 18 were all Jewish.
Well, we have places, believe it or not, Jerry's Men's Shop on James Street North was started by their father, Uncle Sherman, in 1916. And they lived above the store. And now, 3 generations later, that business is still going. And then you drive up the street and there's another menswear store there, Irving's Famous Clothiers, which started in 1915, even older than Sherman's. And that business is still going, started in 1915. Wentworth Auto Recycling, Sam Roshberg, it's now, I think, also third generation. That started in 1933. And then when I spoke to Harold about that, they brag about the fact that it didn't start in 33. The business started in 33, but Mr. Roshberg was a peddler before that with a horse and wagon. So that company's been around. I'm not very good in mathematics, but that's a long, long time ago. Another old one, the Miller Shoe Store, dates back to 1926.
The whole hat business sort of collapsed. I don't think it's ever really revived. So we switched into, first of all, ladies' wear, and finally bridal. And Leeds of Hamilton was a bridal shop at the corner of King and Catherine for 40-odd years.
Right on King Street, all the merchants were on King Street, and where it is between King and Bay now, where you have the Sheraton Hotel and you have the Standard Life and you have the Stelco Tower, from James right down to Bay were all stores with apartments above them. And if you go 1 block west to Bay Street going west, and you see the Regal Hotel there, and you see all the stores with the places above that continues right out to Victoria Park, that's the way it was. It was that way right to King Street, to James Street. And amongst those stores were a lot of Jewish merchants. Levinson's Shoes was there. I think Lester Goldbert had his fur shop, Modern Furs. There was Bube's Ladies Wear. Harry Kellman had Marvell Jewelers, or Kellman Jewelers, whatever it was. Mr. Steinberg, Bailey Waxman's father, had the Belgium shop, which was a dress shop. What's his name? Al Till had a little kids' wear shop. Jack Giddis had a fur shop. I mean, it was like that was a local area, and York Street was behind.
So King Street East was, as I say, it was very interesting. And just to name some of the people who had stores there, there were the Roafs. They had Roaf's Ladies Wear. There was ourselves, Leeds of Hamilton. There was Wasserman, Saul Wasserman and his son Marv had started out as an electrical store, became a furniture store. Of course, Adler's was a big furniture store there. Rafel Mack, very high class ladies wear. There were a few of them. Liberty Ladies Wear, which was near the corner of Catherine and King. Mo Levy was the proprietor there, and that was another high-class ladies' wear. And Minden's was another stalwart on King Street. They were on the south side of the street, up very close to James. Ben Silvert had a store called the Sally Silver Shop. Willie Roden had the Sample Shop. Mona Snyderman, Bar Sportswear, Ab Walters, Faye Jackson's. Got to mention Faye Jackson's. She was a terrific retailer. And she was really the first bridal shop in Hamilton. And she was so forward-looking, and she promoted her business in a very professional way, and even advertised in the big American bridal magazines.
Our family, for instance, in the auto wrecking business. And my father started in business in '47, April of '47, and he came out of Hamilton Auto Parts, which I did some homework on that. I couldn't believe what I came up with. 18 businesses were spawned by Hamilton Auto Parts alone. 18 auto parts businesses. I got them all listed here. And scrap dealer. Somehow or other, a major connection for business in Hamilton was through automotive. From beginning to end, new parts, used parts, scrap.
In Hamilton, there was, in the coal business, there was a gent by the name of Steinberg who ran a very, very small business. We weren't large, but we were much larger than he was. No, there was, basically it was not a business for a Jewish boy, because it was all hard work. And we used to deliver coal in 200-pound bags, 10 bags to the ton on your back, because if there was no driveway, you had to schlep it from the sidewalk or from the curb to the bin. So it was a rough, tough business.
Most of the Jewish community were either retailers or professionals. There were two reasons for this. First of all, as Jews at that time, none of us could work for any company or business unless it was Jewish owned, or as a result of which most of the Jews that came here ended up opening up their own stores. Because most of the Jews in Hamilton came from Eastern Europe, where they had been peddlers or professionals. They naturally continued that on here, and so that most of the retailers, or sorry, most of the Jewish community, were in retailing.
How did I get into medicine? Well, the late Dr. Siegel was on Barton Street, and he's Ted Siegel's mother, and he had a son, Ted, and he went into medicine actually eventually, but Dr. Siegel knew I was getting scholarships or so, and he says, you know, it'd be a shame if you didn't go into medicine. And he sort of encouraged me to go into medicine. I feel I would have gone into business, and I could have been in recycling, had a Porsche, a condo down in Florida. I think A.B. ruined my life.
So in Hamilton, we only had three specialists. We're Jewish. Mike Carr, who really was a great contributor. Mike was probably one of the best pediatricians I've ever come across, best clinicians I ever came across. And Joe Minden and myself. So we only three of us were specialists. And that was the only time you could do something to change things in hospitals. You know, all the other chaps were, were family doctors.
The Chicken Roost was a gathering place for Hamilton. And that's not restricted to Jewish Hamilton, but to pretty well anybody who ever came downtown. It was just a destination. It was a sort of made up of two stores. One side was booths, the other side was tables. And the booths all had these cartoon type of, well, more or less in every booth, little cartoons having to do with chickens. Although Max Mintz based his business on chicken on a bun, which was the most sort of egalitarian dish on the menu, he was prepared to make just about anything you wanted. And if he had a customer who requested a certain dish, he'd make it for him.
The most important thing is when you're in the restaurant business, don't fool the people. Give them what they want, and if you can't give them, admit it, and you can't go wrong. Deliver. We're supposed to be 10 ounces, give them 11, don't give them 9. And admit what you don't know, and you can't go wrong. And buy the best.
His real pièce de résistance was the shrimp and lobster salad. And this salad had big chunks of shrimp and lobster and a wonderful dressing.
People were walking down the street on King Street. If you didn't come down by 10 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, you couldn't walk by. We had the Chicken Roost. Wonderful people came, Goyim, Black, Yiddish, Chinese. The world was safe. It was wonderful.
Rabbi Levine came to Hamilton, I believe, in 1906. I'm not certain of that. He organized the Talmud Torah in 1911. Until that time, everyone had their own teacher. He also checked the kashrut of the butchers. There were 3 butchers in those days for 2,500 people. He was a very kind man, an ardent Zionist, an impassioned speaker when it came to speak on the Holy Land. You have to understand that there were not the young, observant Jews that you see today. People were more apt to assimilate rather than remain frum. His seat was the Hess Street Shul. They brought him over. He made it his business to go to every shul, each week a different shul, so that he was indeed the Rav of Hamilton. He treated Jew and Gentile alike, by the way. He was a very generous man. He didn't take pay from the community. He had his own business.
Inside, it was built on the old Sephardic way with the bima in the middle. Now, everything that went in there, when you think of it, who built that shul? Peddlers. The peddlers, the poor people built that shul. Inside, It was built out of the finest hardwood. They had 3 chandeliers in there that were so magnificent. I'm telling you, enormous, gorgeous crystal, pure crystal chandeliers. I think they're in some very ritzy restaurants in Toronto now. And the women sat upstairs, and they had beautiful crystal brackets all over there where the women sat. The benches were lovely, fine, the finest wood. Everything there was beautiful, really beautiful. And downstairs they had a hall with a kitchen, and the women looked after that. But there was a Mrs. Perlman that she did the cooking. She did a lot of the cooking. And I you know, when I hear what it costs now to make a simcha, we laugh. It used to be, nu, wieveel mensen geht u hebben? How many people are you going to have? Oh, 100. 100? Davon haben 25 chickens. So we need 25 chickens. You counted by every 4 people. 1 chicken was 4 people.
Before Rabbi Green, there was no permanent full-time rabbi at Cannon Street.
Oh.
I'm not sure how they handled it, but I know that there was a different cantor every year, and the late Rabbi Levine would come around and make a speech, but there was no organization. It was just a shul that people came to daven morning and night, and on Saturday and high holidays, and after that there was nothing.
Well, let me just describe the mood that I encountered when I first came to Hamilton. That was Parshas Baloscha in 1958. It was June, around June time. If I'm to make a real impression, I have to tell them, Rambams, Bim Bums, whatever it was, that these people would be very impressed. So obviously, Friday night did not go over too well. So Shabbos morning, I gave a sermon once again in English, not knowing the mixture of the congregation. And once again, one of the important Balabatim took me for a walk in the market. There was a market on James Street, and he says, Rabbi, it seems that you've learned a lot of Torah, but we in this community, you have to know how to relate to these people. And it seems that what you said may have relevance, but did not have much relevance to us. So I recognized that, and I felt a sense of relief. And then when it came to Shalosh Shudas Mincha time, then we had only about 15 people, and these were the peddlers who spoke only in Yiddish and the shochet. And therefore, I felt very comfortable, and I gave a shiur. And since the shochet was sitting there, so I gave a halacha shiur on Hilchas Shrita, just because he was already in his late 70s, and here I was 24. So I felt, if we are going to relate as my shochet, he must know that I know something about Shrita and the various halachas. So at the end of that, he said to a few of the peddlers, "Das heißt darauf." This is a rabbi.
On Cannon Street shul, that was strictly religious shul. I mean, they no fooling around there, because it was loaded with Jews. Okay, they all lived around the Railway Street, Cannon Street, Hess Street, and this was a beautiful shul. A beautiful shul. They used to have weddings in there, and downstairs they had a big, huge room for affairs and stuff like that. But I used to go, there like to weddings and bar mitzvahs, gang of us. When the affair was downstairs, the food and everything, we'd all crash. So I spent a lot of time in the attic. Not so much upstairs, but downstairs.
When Rabbi Green came to Hamilton, shortly after, the talk was that they're going to build a shul in Hamilton. Well, the Cannon Street Shul had maybe 100 members. Most of them were peddlers, a couple of shopkeepers, and there was no money there, but they, I don't know how Max did it, but they bought the land. They hired a super architect who built this, or who designed this beautiful shul that today looks like it was just built yesterday. Leo Welkowitz was a member, he was the builder, and the Royal Bank was the financier.
The temple was another situation, another world entirely. I remember Rabbi Feldman, Arthur Feldman, who had a very good rapport with Rabbi Levine. He would come to him at least once a month. It was a more tolerant society, I think, than we have today.
So he said, "Where are you davening this year?" "Oh, we're going to Hess Street Shul." So go to Hess Street Shul, they ask the same question later on. "Oh, Ferguson Avenue." And that we would rotate between them.
My family were divided. My father was a conformist of the old school, and he used to go to the synagogue at Beth Jacob, and my mother went to Anshe Sholem, which was the Reform. And that's how I was brought up. I would go over and see my father at one and my mother at the other.
Is that right?
I always thought it was semi-ridiculous, which it was, but that's life.
So I grew up in Temple Anshe Sholem, and when I was a kid, it was on Houston Street in the old temple. That was a very warm community of multi-generational community, and it was in many ways a large extended family. I felt very comfortable there. Everybody knew who I was. The thing I remember is that in the days when we were on Houston Street, on the high holidays, there was always a lot of toing and froing between the Beth Jacob, which was where the old City Hall is, and many of us went back and forth several times on those days. So I think a lot of people maybe were members of both the temple and the Beth Jacob, which was at that time Orthodox. I, as a child, was certainly not aware of any other synagogue in Hamilton. I wasn't aware of the Addis Israel at all. It wasn't on my radar screen. When I was about 11, the new temple was built, and that was a real turning point. I think the number of members increased by that time.
A couple of years later, when we moved out, we were about 300. And that growth was phenomenal because it was part of this whole post-war expansion, this suburban, tying your loyalty now not to leftist organizations, which had very little religious significance, but to congregations. And the growth of Beth Jacob, which also moved out to this part of town, was characteristic of this growth in the liberal congregation, and then eventually the Orthodox congregation, which moved from where they had been on Cannon Street, which was a small Polish immigrant congregation, moved out here in the glorious edifice. It was all Jews made money, so right away you had a whole different configuration where religion was concerned.
And then, as I say, the Beth Jacob decided it was a shame for them to stay in this shul on Hunter Street if those Polacks, those peddlers, built that shul on Cannon Street, such a lovely shul. And the Hunter Street shul was financed by the Goldblatts.
We were Orthodox at that time, so we belonged to an Orthodox shul. Then they had the Polak shul, with their own shul, and then they had the Reforms. And in a way, and I use the word loosely, we hated each other, and we very seldom socialized. Like, that's why I use the word ghettoized. because we slept within our own enclave, with the exception when young Judea came along.
There were rabbis that came. Beth Jacob would try and bring in a rabbi for the high holidays. In 1936, they brought in a Rabbi Wohlgelernter, but they found that they couldn't pay him when it came to be paid. So he picked himself up and walked over to Cannon Street Shul and stayed there to the end of his term, which was only a few months. Whether he got paid from Cannon Street, I doubt.
We learned the Haftarah, and they had a few, this was on Hunter Street in the Beth Jacob. They had a hall downstairs. It was low ceiling, and you went down there and you got a piece of herring and some sponge cake or honey cake. And I remember the gift I got, a fountain pen, silver dollar, and one of my relatives from Toronto gave me a gold piece, a $5 gold piece. That was a big deal.
We had to raise money for the Beth Jacob. So one of the songs that I sang for her, and I don't remember all the words, she came out with a song, Avinu vini leshu, Avinu vini leshu, the butcher, the baker, the cake maker, Ovei avini leshu.
Ferguson Avenue Shul was incorporated in 1914 by Romanian Jews. It was a mansion that was converted into a shul, in that they took down the ceiling from the lower floors and built a balcony around. It was a small but very attractive little shul, typical of the age. The blue ceiling with the gold and silver stars and the signs of the zodiac, mazolos, all the way around. And it was small. There was about 70 members. There weren't any devoted members in the end. It met an ignominious end. It was sold off cheaply. The money was divided, which is strictly against halacha. The Sifrei Torah were divided also against halacha. And I think that it closed in 1963.
And then there was the Ferguson Avenue Shul. That was on Ferguson Avenue. That was called the Broigus Shul. Do you know what Broigus means? Angry shul. If anybody couldn't get along with the people in their shul, they went there. Well, you see, you get 3 Jews and you get 4 shul.
I think the main thing was that we were very highly organized. The women had Hadassah, they had the Pioneer Women, the National Council of Jewish Women, there were 3 or 4. Our activities were always involved in organizations. And of course all the synagogue sisterhoods. The men had B'nai B'rith, the synagogue men's clubs, the Zionist organization.
I was just a little girl. I was about 6 or 7. Anyway, all of a sudden this woman came, and she spoke perfect English. She was a teacher, and she was so homely that we wondered, what on earth is she doing here? Gold in my ear. She was sent from the Pioneer Women, which was Matzat HaPeolat. She came here to form the Pioneer Women. It wasn't Pioneer Women then, it was the Arbiter Farban. All these women were wives of the men who belonged to the Arbiter Farban. And strong Zionists, I don't think there's anywhere in the world any stronger. Anyway, all I can tell you is that she came and she lectured. And there were a group of women who agreed to break away from the Verband and form the Pioneer Women. Mrs. Schechter, the late Jack Schechter's mother, Lillian Schechter, that was named the Pioneer Women, the first one, Lillian Schechter chapter. Molly Tadelbaum, a few of the Kritzer women. There was about 10 of them broke away and formed the Pioneer Women. Now listen to this. My father made my mother promise that she would never join the Pioneer Women until Mrs. Vonken passed away. Mrs. Vonken passed away, she was 103. My mother was 87. Listen. Anyway, what happened was my mother on the QT always supported them, always begged for them, always never went to a meeting, but always saw to it that she bought the tickets whenever they had them. It was unbelievable the things she did quietly because she didn't want to hurt Mrs. Vonken. And when Mrs. Vonken died, we got wind of it. My mother had passed away, unfortunately. And what happened, my mother left in her will to adopt a child from the Pioneer Women. I've got it up, a plaque up here on this, with a picture of a boy. I don't know, we don't know who he is, but imagine that it was $600. That was a lot of money for my mother, but she left it. And I don't know how many other people ever did that, but she wanted to know that she could be a Pioneer Woman posthumously. And she did. I have the papers to show that she became a member. Isn't that something? And the Pioneer Women, they had this group who were wonderful. I can't say they weren't wonderful. They were. My mother adored them. But then a younger group started, which I belonged to from the time, let's see, Michael was 2. Michael's 58 years ago.
Well, my mother used to be a ticket seller supreme. She would go out for the Pioneer Women. This is when they went door to door, and nobody refused her.
All of these organizations ran activities. The biggest, of course, was the Hadassah Bazaar. It was held every November, and it was extremely successful. It attracted an enormous rummage sale. And because the Jewish women gave clothes, the people, and I'm talking about the 30s and 40s, and the very poor people used to line up for hours before to get in to get at the rummage that was there. Sold for very good price, very low prices, but nonetheless it raised a lot of money. Another key thing of that was Mrs. Hershkowitz's famous chicken dinner that everybody went to and they bought tickets for. All of the Hadassah chapters had booths there and got various things from, a lot of it was getting things from the manufacturers that sold to the retail stores. The retailers would hit the manufacturers up for donations.
I had never belonged to any kind of a Zionist organization before I married and came to Hamilton. And I'd been married for about a year, and I had a little baby, a little boy, Howie. And I wanted to belong to something and make some friends because I didn't know very many people. I didn't know anybody outside of Molly Bube. She was the only one I knew other than Norman's family. So I joined Hamilton Hadassah. The name of the chapter was Henrietta's Old. I have to tell you that through the years, there were about 11 or 12 chapters of the Hadassah, and I have them all written out here if you are interested in knowing the names of them. What are they? There were, the senior chapter was called the Marietta chapter. Then there was the Sharon. They were the next in age. Our chapter was the third. Our chapter started in 1945. It was a bride's chapter. The other chapters were the Nordo chapter, the Rebecca Taylor chapter, the Tzippa Pakin chapter, the Ada Hershkowitz chapter, the Hannah Zenas chapter, the Chai chapter, the Aviva chapter, and the Hatikva chapter. These are all chapters of Hamilton Hadassah. And there was another chapter called the Israeli chapter. These were women who did not want to belong to a chapter, but they wanted the affiliation. They wanted to know when there was something happening so they could send a donation, but they were working women and they didn't want to belong to a chapter per se. In those days, women didn't go out to work the way they do today. They stayed home and they looked after their children, and the men went to work. So there was a lot more time for these women to join organizations.
There was a Mrs. Hershkowitz. Her and my mother used to be the Hi, Makarakis. I used to be on the phone all day long. Call Mrs. So-and-so, she'll give you a chicken, you know, and stuff like that, yeah. They didn't have crowds like they had years and years ago, because years and years ago there wasn't anything for entertainment, so everybody went to the bazaar. And the people, they used to, everybody, I think every woman member of that Hadassah cooked something, whether it was chicken or cake or whatever. So everybody used to wait till the bazaar came, and then they'd spend all their money.
The B'nai B'rith, that started, and then Mrs. Herskowitz started the Hadassah for girls, and I belonged to the first group of the Hadassah. And oh, she used to have a meeting every Sunday afternoon at her house, and she'd bake bulkas with cinnamon. I still taste them. We all went because I think we liked her bulkas. And we were a group. There was Layla Levy, remember Layla? She was a cousin to you. Layla and Sadie Rosen, Cookie Stein, Cookie Rosenblatt. There was Lillian Sutton, the twins, the Barnett twins from the shoe stores. You know, Leo Barnett.
So we got a letter. In those days, Shirley Noseworthy was she looked after the office. Hadassah had an office, she looked after the office. She gave us a letter of introduction, and Molly and I walked up and down King Street, down Ottawa Street, and we went to every single store, and we showed them the letter, and we said, please help us out. And they were very generous. And we had a lot of lovely new gifts to give and to sell, and we started doing that. Toby Mandel, Harriet Smirlick, and Blanche Levitt. We did the food. And there again, we from Tina Zucker, we got the information that the people that she went to, and we got a lot of our own people to go to. And we had a crew making sandwiches. Bolslavsky and Manny Simon and Lefty Bolslavsky donated corned beef, and we got hot dogs, and they came the night before and they made all the sandwiches up for us. And we had a marvelous coffee shop, and we started off at the Jewish Community Center on Delaware.
Now, the Council of Jewish Organizations was composed of representatives from everything in this town, whether it was Hadassah, or whether it was the Pioneer Women, or B'nai B'rith, and the shuls all had representatives. So the council would have about 40 people at some of those meetings. So it was very democratic. Everybody could speak up, and they did.
From the time Israel became a state, there was always problems, and that was a lot of the discussion. Then they talked about in Hamilton, that was on Delaware, that was that time, and they talked about problems in the city, and there weren't a lot with Jewish people at that time.
Now, from the council, then you represented an executive. And the executive met once a week. People can't believe that when I tell them. Every week we would have a packed house of executive members who spoke up. You had leadership really coming up. Bill Morris was one of my presidents one year. After he was finished president, I made him chairman of the welfare fund.
I only became actively involved in the Jewish community when I came back from law school in 1960. And a lot of the stories to which you made reference earlier, I heard about as well, because the Jewish community had plateaued by the time I got here. I mean, Bill Stern was the, what do we call him? I guess the executive director of our then Council of Jewish Organizations.
Shalom really started at one of our meetings. Why do I say that? Shalom Village I'm talking about. Must have been about 1966. What was the director's name, that wonderful lady?
Sheila Berman?
Sheila. I'm sitting just like we're sitting in my office one day, knock on the door. It's Sheila, she comes in, sat down. Just came from England, looking for work. Well, you know, what do you do? He says, well, I work with older people. Well, you know, life is full of coincidences. We were really just starting our seniors program at that time. And I took her on for part-time. We really didn't have a budget for a seniors program. We were just getting started. And she came on. She was like a piece of gold falling in my lap. I was very lucky as I look back with people. And she got a program going, which, well, the need was there. You know, that people were living longer and so on. And eventually there was a house next door. I don't know if you remember, Wendy, right on the corner. Gladstone, is that the name of the street? We bought that house. You're talking about issues. There was a whole thing around purchasing that house, you can imagine. And that became the seniors' house. This is really the beginning of Shalom Village.
My father came to Hamilton, and he didn't know anybody other than us. And he realized that if he and my mother were to get old, what would happen? The original plan was that was his motive, and Dad just motivated people and got people involved, tried to tell them the need, and one could tell almost as though he had the vision that people would grow older. Dad went to the government and spoke to all kinds of people to determine that there was a need, and he was refused constantly, but they still remember, because when it was finally established and the groundbreaking ceremony, the ministers came and remembered and said, Mr. Venerio or Ludwig or whatever they said. And he never saw it. My father did not see. My mother was at the groundbreaking ceremony, but my father was not around anymore.
Well, they'd have for kids. I remember even before the one on John Street, the one on Vine Street, we had a summer camp there when we were kids. Yeah. And we would go there and we'd do the painting on glass, all that arts and crafts stuff. Yeah. So the Vine Street, which that became with the funeral home later on. And our Talmud Torah was just down the street, our Jewish school.
I was with the junior group, and they were the 3 and 4 years old, and it was in the John Street Community Center, and it was such a hot summer. And what they would do, there was a mother and a daughter, and I think the daughter was a school teacher, and they would come and they would live in this barracks community down east somewhere, and they would come and they ran the junior group, and I was sort of their CIT, junior counselor, whatever, and they would give me the little roustabouts to take upstairs after lunch, the ones that wouldn't settle down, and we would go up to this hot little room, and we would swelter up there until it was time to come down and go to the beach. And I remember going to the beach, Station 26.
It started on Vine Street, where the cheder was. Downstairs was some kind of office for, the Depression came along, and then there were a lot of people that needed assistance. So there was a social worker, and I think she worked in that office.
It wasn't until later when the community bought on John Street, and I remember Jack Schechter was a real estate agent at the time, and he managed a deal for the community. And but that was a good hangout. There we went, and I remember we had a lot of plays and so on, and skits and things of that nature.
But then the Jewish Youth Center moved to John Street North. I think that was in 42, because it was there from 42 to 45 when it opened in Delaware. And it was a school, and it wasn't used, and so it had an auditorium or gymnasium. It had a lot of classrooms which used as club rooms, and in the back there was an area which I guess had been the playground, which was converted into a tennis court. And for most of us that meant, well, and I think almost for everybody, that was the first opportunity any of us had ever had to play tennis. And whenever the weather was nice, that's exactly what we do. But we lived there.
Maybe every other Saturday we would go to either Kitchener or Guelph, or they would come to the center, and we had a lot of fun. It was wonderful. Good friends. We would invite, well, you know, hoping boys would come. Yeah, and they did, and we had really, really, really nice times. No one actually went like, we didn't go steady with one person. We always went as a group.
You know what? An awful lot of time was spent at the Jewish Community Center with my friends on John Street. And we used to have dances there and parties there. And then after we used to go to meetings, we used to all go on York Street, it was York Street then, Majestic Restaurant, and we thought that was the biggest thing to go for a Coke and French fries, but we never told our parents we were having French fries in the restaurant.
The center was the center of activity for our group. We went there for Talmud Torah. We went there for arts and crafts. We went there for Sunday program. I mean, it was the center of our activities, and it was great. It was what we knew. It was what we knew. It was a safe haven, and we had a lot of fun. We had a good time, and they had dances there. But that was later because I was too young back then. There was a time, you know, when I was young.
There was a Jewish Community Center on Vine Street, which was an old converted house. From Vine Street, we went to John Street North, and then from John Street, we went to Delaware Avenue, where there was a very, very beautiful center that was built. Unfortunately, it was built in the wrong part of town. Had it been built in Westdale, where all the Jews were going, it could have been still standing today.
1956, I find myself as a staff member here. My title at that time was Director of Activities, which meant I was really the program director. All age groups, from nursery to golden age, it all fell under my jurisdiction. And we had some very good programs going. Yeah, well, the Talmud Torah in those days was on the second floor, right? And my office was on the second floor. So the teachers were always coming in. It said group work on my office, and I shared that with Sam Brownstone. And Max Rotman, who was supposed to be downstairs, was always in my office. So we had a tremendous camaraderie, the three of us. Matter of fact, if you go into the new building, I was surprised. I went in there one day and the three of us are there in a picture.
I came as a youth and camp director. We first started John Street North. Max Rotman was involved later on, and he took over the phys ed department, and he helped with the camp. There are many areas that shone. One was our day camp. We had one year 200 members.
Wow.
That was a big responsibility.
Well, Max Rotman was one of these guys that was always at the right place at the right time. I don't know how he did it. Terrific instincts. And if you see photographs of Max with the kids, you'll always see them up either up front with the kids, or he's at the back with the kids up the front. Got some good camp pictures of that someplace. He was a natural. He had done a lot of volunteer work with baseball teams, I think, if I remember correctly, or in basketball teams even more so. If you speak to guys like Cuppy Katz, first thing he's going to talk about is Max Rotman. He was Cuppy's coach.
The Jewish Community Center was a great, great place for Jewish kids. I wasn't there very much. I was only there 5.5 days a week. And the only reason that I wasn't there the other day and a half is because it was closed. It closed Friday afternoon for Shabbos and didn't open again until Saturday night. So all my contemporaries, any kid who was interested in sports or a place to play ping pong or to go to a dance or be involved in anything, went to the community center. This community center was working very, very well. And we had one of the great people was Max Rotman.
He was the kind of a guy like, my son is autistic, you know, but Max always made sure he was on the floor. I mean, all the guys would be up at that end, and he'd still be down at this end. I mean, it would take him off eventually, but this is the kind of guy Max was. He was a natural born social worker, really, who had a tremendous feeling for people.
Someplace you wanted to be because there were guys like him around who would pat you on the back and give you a kick in the backside if you needed it, whatever it took. And it was a great, great place.
I think that all our evenings or days were spent at the Jewish Community Center. I was there a considerable period of time as I was growing up in my teenage years. And as I pointed out, because the schooling was there, you were there. So you just automatically filtered into the sports program or the social program or whatever was taking place. And it was a vibrant place because at that point a lot of the athletes would come down and get massages. A guy named Pinky Lewis was there that would massage the athletes, and the wrestlers, a couple of Jewish wrestlers, Martin Hatzler I guess, and being one of them, and Jack Laskin would be down there. So, and the football players would come down because Pinky Lewis was a trainer for a lot of for the Hamilton Tiger Cats. So they would be there on a Sunday. It was a great spot. It really was a great spot. I have no regrets growing up in Hamilton and having the Jewish Community Center there.
Everybody had a name. There was how much? I don't even know what his name was, just how much? Everybody knew who how much was.
Because why? Because
he always asked, how much? If you wanted he wanted to buy something, how much? Then there was, oh God, there was so many. I'm sorry my sister isn't here. Everybody knew these people. Really? You did have this, oh yeah, it was Shakespeare. That was Bornstein. His daughter is Evelyn Cohen. They called him Shakespeare. Why? He would tell stories. Whatever he would tell, they said, he's like Shakespeare, he tells stories. Everybody had a name.
There was another guy, we used to call him harness maker. The Jewish guy, he made harnesses. So they gave him a name, the harness maker.
Zieskind Bolslavsky. Now he was a very influential man in Hamilton. How was he influential? First of all, he had the store, a delicatessen on York Street. Everybody that came to Hamilton used to go in through his place. You had to go in there. Where are you going to go where a bunch of Jews are? Everybody was there at Zieskind's. It was like a club at night. Everybody would go over there for a bottle of pop. You would sit there all night.
Mr. Schiffman told me this story just about 2 months ago. We got talking about the music business, and I happened to bring up Benny Goodman's name. And he says, you know, it's funny, Benny, when he was here, he had a yurt site, and he went to the synagogue, and he said after he got saying davening, he was praying at his prayers, he handed whoever was in charge, I think, a $20 bill. And Schiffman said the guy nearly went wild. He never saw $20 in his life. You know, you're talking back in the 40s.
One day, we were standing on the corner of Caroline and York Street. We used to gather there, the teenagers, and the car drove up, and Benny Goodman got out, and he said, is there a synagogue around here? I have a yurt site. So we said, yeah, we'll take you. So we took him to the Addis Synagogue, Cannon Street Shul. Yeah. And we had a minyan. There were enough of us guys and a few there in the synagogue. And we helped him with the Kaddish and everything. When he was finished, he took out a $100 American bill and gave it to the shamus. And then we went back to the car with him, and he thanked all of us. And it was a nice person.
My grandfather had cancer. And in those days, one of the remedies was if you would get a freshly laid egg, remember what I'm telling you, within 3 or 4 hours and give it to the patient, that was a big cure for cancer. There was a farmer outside of Hamilton. I don't know if it was near Burlington, but it was in that distance. And one of my duties was when the farmer would call up, I would have to get in the car and pick it up and bring it back right away. So I'm doing this 4 or 5 or 6 times. Remember how old I was in those days. And I went to my dad once, I said, you know, Dad, I'm too important to have to go in the car and pick up an egg. Why don't you hire somebody, get one of the goyim to do it? I'll never forget, my dad looked at me, he says, you know, Marvin, you're right. He says, come with me. Get in the car, he drives right to Burlington. After that, I never said a word. But that is strictly in my mind. It's unbelievable. Here I am, a young pisher. I'm too important. And my dad turns around and he says, you're right, Marvin. By the way, I kept on picking up the eggs, so you'll know.
As a young man in the Russia/Ukraine, he was writing plays and poetry in Yiddish. So he came by it naturally when he came here as a printer. He started to publish the paper, Henry, Chrisha in Russian. And so his Hebrew name is Yedidya, which is beloved of God, I understand. The thing that really galled him was he was educated and literate, and many of the immigrants only could make an X for their name, and they had to have it witnessed. And this group of people were coining money, and that ground him that these Proste Yidden were making money. And here's a guy that is knowledgeable and couldn't make it with his hands.
Rocca Perry was the kingpin in Hamilton, directed by mafia from New York or Montreal or wherever. So you heard the story about his wife being shot. They came home late at night, drove up to the garage. He asked her to open the door. Her name was Bessie Starkman, Jewish lady. And she was going to open the door and she got shot. So now, Rocca Perry goes to the synagogues and he wants to bury his wife. They said, because of an unnatural death in the Jewish religion, she's to be buried by the fence. He says, I'll give you more money, don't bury her by the fence. They says, no. So he went to another synagogue, and the one up the mountain, up Upper James Street, the Jewish synagogue there, she was buried by the fence. And so were other Jewish people who committed suicide. They were by the fence. Well, he waited about a year, and then he went to the farmer who owned the property behind the fence, and he bought a piece of property, and he donated it to the synagogue, and now she's in the middle of the cemetery.
This is the infamous one that we have. Used to be Bessie Perry, and we were always inundated with people who wanted to take pictures. Now they don't bother us anymore. She was Pesel Bas Reb Shimon HaKoyen. It's interesting, she was assassinated. They say that the bullets was meant for him, but they killed her in the garage of their home as she drove up in 1930. And my grandmother told me that she was supposed to, they all dolled her up, you know, in fine clothes and makeup and everything. And then the rabbi said that she could be buried in a Jewish cemetery because she is Jewish, or was Jewish, but no one should be buried around her. In subsequent years, people didn't know this, so they did bury people around her. So when the Chaver Kadisha came, they removed all the makeup, the clothes, put on tachrichen on her, and my grandmother described how the Italians stood by the women with their arms folded and very, very upset. Mm-hmm. There were truckloads of flowers which she allowed to the gate, not into the cemetery. And Perry, in grateful what was done for her, put up a fence around the cemetery, this here fence.
The station was owned by a senator, Senator Hardy, and he built the station or got the license for his son. Unfortunately, his son was an alcoholic, and the station was going nowhere, so he hired Ken Sobel to be the manager of that station. I guess Sobel's eventual plan was to buy the station. And he was forced into buying it quicker than he planned because one time a Hamiltonian by the name of Jack Kent Cooke, who was probably the most famous of Canadian broadcasters eventually. He eventually went to Los Angeles. He owned the Washington Redskins. He owned the Los Angeles Lakers. Hugely wealthy guy who was born in Hamilton. He wanted to buy CHML, but Ken Sobel had first grab at it. So Ken Sobel bought CHML, I guess, early 1940 or something like that. And I started at the station in 1945. And we were in the Pickett building. The studios were in the basement of the Pickett building. And his offices were on the up third, fourth floor. He liked riding horses. And there was a ranch on Governor's Road owned by Victor Smith, who had a business machine company in Hamilton, and he wanted to sell it. And Ken Sobel bought it for $25,000, that whole piece of property there, and it had a ranch house, and that was, he always had a way of having he was a businessman, and he had a media, so he used Bar 11 Ranch. He probably paid for it by putting it on television. Now, we skipped ahead the fact that he became one of the owners of a television station in Hamilton. Through his ideas and his experience and his vision, he was the seed man for a lot of things that eventually happened in Canada.
Well, Manny Batchow came here in 1950, I guess. But he was one of the top professionals. Good Montreal boy, what do you expect? And he came in here when Ken Sobel was active. And he and Ken were separable. They worked very hard. Ken Sobel means something to you. He was a big mucker in this community. But what Manny Batchow was able to do was to set up a solid foundation. He was a tremendous leader. And he got programs going. Well, as a matter of 1950, the building was completed at Delaware. That was before I got here. So Manny must have come in here late 47 or 48 because he was responsible for raising the funds and getting that building set up.
Max Stein, as most of the people in Hamilton would know, was an insurance broker. And Max taught me a lot about community work and taught me a lot about giving. And Max was a catalyst in this community. He was very, very good with younger people, because when I first met Max, I was in probably my late 20s. And I remember I had been president of one of the Hamilton Lodge B'nai B'rith, and he plucked me out to go on the executive of the then Council of Jewish Organizations, and he wanted me to be president. I was president at age 32. I know I'm not talking about Max Stein, but Max was the person that made things run in the community. He was the peacemaker.
But when Marjorie was at a meeting, it was always interesting. You know, she was a meeting person. She's the kind of person you pray to have at a meeting, but things were always percolating. And a lot of people were opposed to her, but they always respected her intelligence, which was very high.
In the 60s and 70s, no campaign in this community could ever start without what we call the Big Three. And the Big Three were Marvin, Chester, and Frank Levy. Marvin is, to my way of thinking, is unique. He is one of a kind. What is he, early 80s today? I mean, we need him for a long time, because there's not a more generous soul in this community and than he is.
In the 40s, of course, most of the men were in the Army. A lot of the Jewish community volunteered to go overseas. You didn't have to go overseas. That was a volunteer situation. You could just do your military service. But most of the Jewish community, the men 18, 25 or older even, were in the Army, and we had a few war heroes, fighter pilots that were very eminent at that time.
I know the percentage of Jewish fellows were higher than any other minority group. I think at that time, if my memory serves me correctly, there were 167,000 Jewish people living in Canada, and I think 11.7% served in the services.
I think there were about, I don't remember, there were 1,600 or 16,000, which would be, we were about 10% of the Jewish population in the service. Not just Hamilton Jews, all over Canada. In Hamilton, I don't know what there would have been, maybe a couple of hundred.
I joined in June of 1942 and got out, I think it was in August of 46. I was in Canada, Britain, and in Germany.
We were stationed, the main station was Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. Out of Yarmouth, we flew these huge, we called the Castle was the name of the plane. It was an amphibious plane. It could land on the water, and they would go out the Atlantic Ocean for 8 hours and come back for 8 hours, 16 hours that they're out there.
I had never eaten, when I first enlisted, I had never eaten non-kosher food at that time. And they said, once you're in the service, whatever you're served, it's okay. And this was at Manning Depot in Toronto. So the very first meal, it was lunch, pork and beans. It was like taking castor oil, you know. Not that it wasn't tasty, but I had a mental block against it.
There was David Goldberg, who was a flight commander. He was an officer. My brother Benny, Morris Smerlick was in the Air Force. Goldie Goldberg, I think, was in the Air Force. I don't know of many more.
Hamilton had a real hero in David Goldberg. Dave was a pilot. He was flying Spitfires, and he was shot down and parachuted to safety into France and through the French underground. He got back to Britain and came back to Hamilton and was suitably recognized, etc. And afterwards, once you've been shot down on escape, you don't have to return, but Dave did. He had flown, and I have that in the record, I thought it was incredible, 234 missions over Italy, France, Britain, and Germany, and all the other European countries. And he was given a Distinguished Flying Cross, too.
I was shot down and lived with the underground in Europe, and managed to get over the Pyrenees into Spain, out to Gibraltar, and I guess that was quite a feat in those days.
Well, there was Ali Ballinson. He was killed, and he was buried in Malta, and I don't know the date offhand. Ali has a brother, Morty, who served in the Canadian Army during the war, and he also served in Korea, and Morty is still in Hamilton.
When the war started, my older brother was a medical officer, and he was on the reserve, so he went in, and Alec joined the Air Force. And because of his size, he was too big to be a fighter pilot. So he was a wireless air gunner. It means he manned a machine gun, and he was on the wireless for their communication with headquarters and plane to plane. My brother was killed in a bombing raid with one of his colleagues, and he's buried in Malta at the Capuchin Naval Cemetery.
There was a fellow, Sid Lees. Sid was born in Russia, came here as a young man, but he joined, and he was shot down on his 28th operation over the Europe. There was a fellow named Feldman who was reported missing. And I remember, and this was a rather emotional thing, they lived on Grant Avenue in Hamilton. And I was in the service at that time, and I went down one evening. It was early. It wasn't dark, but it was dusky. But anyways, so he was reported missing at that time. And anyways, I went down there, and his mother opened the door and thought it was her son. But regardless, I think about 6 months later, they found his body.
When Hitler occupied Austria, my aunt said to my uncle, "It's time for us to go." My sister was 12 and I was 15. For me it was an adventure. But for my parents and the other generation it was very difficult. But we got by, we managed.
My father was president of CJO when I was a kid, and when he was president, the kids came over from Europe, you know, all the kids that were in the war, and I was at the center. I met every group that came in, because I went with my dad, because that's when he was president. And I met everybody that came in. I knew all the kids that came here. Solly Cohen was one of them. Solly Cohen, the butcher. The ex-butcher, oh yeah, every time he always tells everybody, do you know she was the first person I met, the first young person I met when I came to Hamilton?
I came in 1948. The government wouldn't allow in so easily, the Canadian government. So the Canadian Jewish Congress tried to get a special quota for orphans, and we were all orphans because we lost the families. So that's the way. So they brought us over from Germany. Everything was the Canadian Jewish Congress did it. So we came, for example, so every community got a certain amount. Hamilton became 6. 3 boys, 3 girls.
They came to John Street, the John Street Center, and it was very touching when they all came in. You felt so bad because here you grew up here, and they all came from war. I don't know if they were adopted. I know that Rosie Soley, did you know Rosie Soley? Rosie Soley and her brother David both came over at the same time. She was 8 years old. And Mrs. Tadelbaum, who you wouldn't remember, adopted Rosie, and she wanted to adopt David, but he wanted to keep his name. He lived with them. He moved in with Mr. and Mrs. Tadelbaum. They had a store on James Street North, and they took them in, and Mrs. Tadelbaum just loved that Rosie. And she ended up marrying a Hamilton doctor, Dr. Soley.
The community tried to arrange places for everyone. For example, 6 came before us, like Morris Kaufman. It was him and a few other boys. We came in January of 48. They came December 47. Okay, so then we were the second group that came.
Then I went to school. Lived with a Jewish family by the name of Sam and Frida Pollack. They took my cousin and me into their home as war guests. I went to Westdale and helped with the housework. Had my room and board. And I did that for 3 years. 39, 40, 41. Murray and Rose Silbert took us into their home while Mr. and Mrs. Pollack were in Florida. And we stayed with them for about 6 weeks. Now for them it was a real sacrifice. They were just married. They bought a couch for us, a sort of a pull-out couch for my cousin and me. We were the same age. And very often we walked from Wentworth Street to Westdale to save streetcar fare. And when they were awfully good to us.
We had a wonderful reception. It treated us very nicely. And of course, it also depends who you talk to. Some of the fellas or the girls, they were never happy. They thought everything is coming to them. There were all kinds of people. I moved in with Mrs. Wolfson. I've never had, very nice to me, and okay. And after when I came back, and I left, so somebody else moved in.
And a lot of kids lived on Catherine Street, some with Jewish people and some with Hungarians that weren't Jewish. And they lived on Catherine Street, so a lot of them moved to Montreal after. And they lived like in the neighborhood I lived in, a lot of them, so I saw them often. So I grew, like, you know, I grew up with them then.
Another great thing that Hamilton had were tea dances at the old Addis Theatre. Now, tea in England is served at 4 o'clock. So the tea dance was at 4 to 6.
Now, I was going to tell you that when we were teenagers, the old Cannon Street Shul had Sunday afternoon tea dances. And Sally Adler, they all came in from Guelph and Kitchener and Galt to be with the tea dances to meet the Jewish girls. It was in the late, wait a minute, now I was 14, 15, 16 in those years. So at 14, it was 19, I was born in 16, it was 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932 area.
My brother Max says, listen, I'm going to rent a cottage in a place called Bronte. And Pa died, we all need to sort of get away from it all. So he rented a cottage, it was an old cottage. When we rented that cottage, the Granicks, which were the Sheikhim, and his sons, were in automotive. They rented the one next door. And my brother chose Bronte because we could drive out there after work every day. We didn't want to see our family away for weekends. And we'd all drive out there. The Zuckers came, the Netkins came, and that was about all the Hamiltonians. There was 200 Jewish families there. The others were all from Toronto. They also went there because they could come and go in their cars and be there every day. And we had a nice community.
Well, Hamilton had its own summer colony, like Jewish colony, down on the beach strip. And there were many people who owned cottages down there. And then, of course, there were rentals too, so that often during the summer, I mean, it was so convenient, you know. People would go down there, families, they'd own a cottage or rent a cottage. And some of the, like the Levies, and I'm not sure whether the Goldblatts had a cottage there, I believe they did. These were huge Victorian cottages with big verandas and all kinds of gingerbread, you know. And they weren't all that way, but there were a few like that. And there was an entertainment center there too, with a ballroom where the big bands used to come. And that was a great center, of course. Besides which, even if we didn't have a cottage there, we knew somebody who did. And I remember going down to visit the Wassermans, Marv Wasserman and Bernie Wasserman at their cottage. And we would go out on the beach. We'd have bonfires at night. And we would listen to the pop music. The music of that day, the big tunes, as I remember, were Chattanooga Choo Choo. You probably know. And Kalamazoo.
But, well, I bought a lot of groups, but the name bands, you talking about the name band?
Yeah.
No, they'd have to play, wherever, there was no Hamilton place back then.
Right.
So we'd play them wherever we could, such as I opened Kitchener Auditorium in 1956 with, I think it was Fats Domino had a hot record at the time, Blueberry Hill. I opened the Dundas Arena in about the same time with Louis Armstrong. And I would play at the Armories. I remember Tommy Dorsey and Lionel Hampton. Can you imagine a band playing in the Armories? Well, back then, you know, the kids, we didn't have no television. And nobody danced. There'd be 2,000, 3,000 people there. They're all stuck up in front of the stage, glued to watching the musicians.
So, anyway, so at the Savoy Theater, I forgot to tell you, they had a stage that burned out, and they built a stage over it. But some of the old parts of dressing rooms were still there, and there were autographs on the wall of people that were there. 1915, who was there? Eddie Cantor, Al Jolson, Molly Pecan. We had a lot of Jewish stars come to Hamilton, and we also had a Jewish theater here. It was in the 20s and 30s. I had a theater. Yeah, I'll tell you who was involved with it. A man by the name of Weinberg was involved with it. And Sunday afternoon, they had the concerts.
We had live bands, not the prices they charge today. It was fun. All the beautiful songs from the 50s and 60s. You can't compare the music today, I don't think. I mean, we didn't have to have our eardrums blown to listen to music. It was, you know, all Frank Sinatra kind of songs, Judy Garland. Sophie Tucker was at the Branton many, many times. She entertained at the Branton. You probably don't know her, you're too young.
The Jewish radio hour is Sunday mornings from 10 to 11. and that was the Harry Harris Jewish Hour. Harry Harris was a actor, a Jewish theatrical person, and a chazan. You know, they did anything in order to make a living in Toronto, and came over here because he couldn't get a program anywhere else. So Sunday morning from 10 to 11 would be the Jewish radio hour. And it would consist mainly of chazan cantorial songs, and eventually when Israeli music came in and Jewish comedy songs, there would be one record, and that record would be sponsored by Crown Bakery and by some other, and he's resold that hour to sponsors, including, I guess one of his money makers was a feature at 10:30 announcing the passing. That's when we announced those who passed away, or unveilings. Everything that went on there was paid for, so that's how he made his living. Before my time on the radio hour, when we played records, they actually had live entertainers on. And Molly Bube, I guess, well, she was in Toronto at the time, and she was, Harry Harris evidently discovered her. She was doing some sort of act somewhere, and I think she was impersonating his radio hour with him, and he fell in love with her and hired her on his programs. She did various shticks and songs and comedy bits. That's before she even came to Hamilton, when she married Harry Bube. And she still did her entertaining here and became quite a force as a personality and as a community worker.
The Harry Harris Jewish Hour, and it was Irving Zucker's father who was very instrumental in that particular show. And whoever went on the Jewish Hour, he would invite them back to the Zucker home for lunch or dinner or breakfast, depending on what time it was. And Mrs. Zucker would never know how many people were coming for lunch or breakfast or dinner. And she would just have to add more water to the soup because they would come in droves. And the best shows were held in her home after the radio show. And we'd have all that wonderful Yiddish music, and everybody would do their shtick, and it was just memorable. I used to do a little recitation that I had learned when I went to Hebrew school. I may remember it, I may not. It's about a little boy who steals into his grandfather's bedroom to take his snuff box. And it goes something like this. Seide, wie ist dein Tabak, Puschke? Ich will euch a Schmeck. Geh, du bist a Stiffer, sagt er. Und geht weg. Dacht ich, als du seidet schlafen, keiner wird nicht sein, will ich auf die spitzen Finger in sein Stüber rein, aussuchen die Puschke Tabak in sein langen Rock, anmessen die große Brillen, umgehen mit sein Stock. Tabak will ich keine schmecken, wieviel noch ich will ich euch sehen, wie seide, a schönes Spiel. Scha. Die Seide muss schon schlafen, bin ich bald beim Tier. Spanne rein zu ihm und kämme es herzlich nicht kein Rehr. Hab ich Seides Rock von Bettel, sich die Brillen aus, nehm die Brillen mitten stecken, in ich gehe raus. Stell ich sich an Kegenspiegel, in sein langen Rock, mit die Brillen auf die Augen, in mein Hand dem Stock. Will ich öffnen die Puschke, kenn ich nicht, zu schwer. Reiß ich sie mit alle Keuches, dreh sie hin und her, bis es reißt sich auf den Deckel mit der größten Prall, flieten Nasen in die Augen, Tabak, bitte, go, abschied, Seide, Giecher, komm mal her, hier, abschied, oi die Augen, Seide, ich will das Ton nicht mehr. Kommt der Seide schnell zu laufen. Hi, ha, abschied, was ist das? So bitter in die Augen, bitter da nass. Aber der Sess, sagt wes naschen Tabak, als der Seide schlafen? Ich weiß, bin gewinner schlechter, hat mich Gott gestrafen. Abschied!